Hello, Read 581, and welcome to week 5. This is a busy but exciting week for us as we start intervention with our students. So let's take a look at what needs to get done. So this week you have 3 readings. First is chapter 2 of Instructing Students, which is on causes and correlates of individual differences in reading ability. And this chapter is a very important chapter that I highly recommend you read, because as a reading professional and, a leader in the field, it's, pretty common that teachers, colleagues, administration will come to you and ask your opinion on different things. And in this chapter, they talk about different factors that maybe have been correctly or incorrectly associated with deficits in reading. And they discuss the research that shows whether or not truly there is a correlation between that factor and a reading deficit. So looking at physiological factors like vision, hearing, speech, and brain function, hereditary factors, emotional factors, sociocultural factors, educational factors, cognitive factors, language factors, and the reading history of the student. And I thought it was very informative. It is a lot of pages, but it reads pretty quickly and so much important information in here. They talk about ADHD and how, students with ADHD, first of all, just thinking about how does one get diagnosed with ADHD? Should it be based on a rating scale or actually due to, some sort of mental cognitive function issue? And then, is ADHD causing a reading difficulty? Or do students with reading difficulties then exhibit some of these, behaviors associated with ADD, where they're doing task avoidant behaviors, they're up out of their seat, they aren't focusing on the reading because they're frustrated, it's too hard for them because they have a reading difficulty or delay. So again, very informative. I highly recommend reading it. It is not the top priority this week. The top priority is Chapter 7. Chapter 7 presents 15 instructional principles that promote successful reading growth. And then it also goes over logistics to consider as you get ready to prepare for intervention. So if you are pressed for time this week, please prioritize Chapter 7 over Chapter 2, but I do think Chapter 2 is very important and want to impress that upon you. And then lastly, if you have the Next Step Forward in Guided Reading, and you look at the section pertaining to the level of reader of your student, there is a guide section which gives you the typically 2-day, could be 3-day lesson plan for your student at that level, and it walks you through exactly what to do for each part of the lesson plan. It's a wonderful structure. I've had great success using it, and I highly recommend it. So those are your readings. Assignments due this week. Technically, nothing needs to be turned in, but you still need to be doing lots of work. You need to be planning and conducting your first intervention session. You need to complete that weekly intervention plan and reflection for session 1, but you're going to turn it in next week with your whipper from session 2. So sessions 1 and 2 go together and get submitted, then sessions 3 and 4 get submitted. So you actually don't need to turn anything in, which might be a nice little break, but you still need to be on top of these plans and reflections. Things to keep on your radar. Next week, the whipper is due. Week 7, the video reflection is due, so I'm trying to push out all of the materials for that to you, so you know what to do for that assignment. And then, as stated, in week 8, you have the whipper from sessions 3 and 4. All right, so just a little bit of content for you this week as we actually start to transition. Weeks 1 through 4, we were focused on course objective number 1 related to assessment. And now we're moving on to objectives 2, 3, and 4. So being able to use research to make decisions about literacy curriculum, instruction, and intervention, to have effective implementation for a learner, Purposefully design and deliver effective individualized instruction that accelerates student learning. That's all you're going to be doing these next 10 weeks. And then lastly, demonstrate high-level skills as a reflective practitioner by engaging in rigorous cycles of reflection for improvement of teaching practice. So that is embedded in the WIPR assignment. So after every intervention session, you're reflecting on the student achievement and performance, as well as your teacher practice and your effectiveness as an educator. And then every 2 sessions, you're really thinking about the program you are developing and designing and how you can improve upon that. And then also we are starting the video reflections and the coaching cycles where you're going to be doing even more reflection. So the next 10 weeks, we will really be focused on these 3 course objectives, and then the remaining weeks of the semester, we are focused on the last 2 course objectives. So that is how we are structured. All right, so chapter 7, you're going to read about 15 important principles of instruction. I have them listed here, and I'm just going to go over them quickly, but you can read about them in more detail, and you should. The first principle is to start early. Basically, don't wait for, the student to be in 4th grade and say, ooh, looks like they didn't get it yet. More time isn't necessarily the answer. Early intervention is the answer to get students caught up. So we don't want inappropriate reading behaviors entrenched. You want to tackle anything you're noticing, as soon as it becomes a problem. Number 2 is to consider one-on-one tutoring, and they talk a lot about the benefits of this, which, is not an issue for us because that is definitely going to be our approach, which isn't always not effective, but feasible in the classroom setting when you have a class of however many students. So, they talk about principle number 3, which is when you are doing group tutoring or teaching, thinking about teacher action. So how can you still create individualized instruction, which doesn't necessarily have to be delivered individually, but in a group setting? But how can you do that and cater to individual needs? Additionally, how can you increase student participation even though they're in a group setting? Because one of the benefits of that one-to-one tutoring is that they have such an increased opportunity to respond and receive feedback from you. 4th principle is to provide collaborative learning opportunities, not as relevant for us in our class, but maybe for you in your practice. 5, consider implications of independent work, and really just considering implications of all the activities you plan. Honestly, the more teacher input and interaction they can get, the better. So sending them to do independent work is not really the best idea in your tutoring sessions. And they give you some, guidelines if you are going to do independent work, like making sure that, the teacher is heavily supervising this. It's only for short periods of time. It's truly appropriate for their instructional level so they're not wasting time or, frustrated by the task. Principle 6 is to consider the time on task. The amount of time students are actually engaged in academic projects is a highly important variable in learning. So you want to provide as much opportunity for them to practice skills and reading as possible, which leads into principle 7, which is let the students read. One of the most decisive factors for promoting growth in reading competence is the processing of large amounts of regular connected reading material, or the amount of time spent actually reading. And that should be reflected in your plan for the session. The student should be spending at least 1/3 of the time actually reading text, either aloud or independently, but you want to provide as much opportunity for them to read as possible. Principle 8 is to thoughtfully match the text to the reader. So in order to do that, you need to know the level of the reader, as far as what is their independent level for text, their instructional level, etc. And then what is the level of the text so that you obviously have a good fit between that. Number 9 is to encourage outside reading. We know there's a strong correlation between the amount of free time reading and reading growth. So how can you motivate them to do some outside reading in a positive way? 10, incorporate high quality literature into the program. So, maybe some poetry, some informational books, using picture books with older students, comic books, graphic novels, magazines. I know were really interesting to my students. I liked, what did I use? Discovery Kids and Zoo Books, that sort of thing. Number 11 is to model effective reading behaviors. So you actually need to demonstrate how to do things. So how to think aloud, how to monitor, and, walk them through that process. Gradual release of responsibility there. All right, principle 12 is to stimulate motivation and engagement. And so it goes over, what is needed to be motivated to do something, basically whether or not I, feel like I might be successful, and then if I have value in the task. So they talk about different ways to instill motivation and engagement through the antecedents as well as the consequences. So, consequences usually has a negative connotation, but here we're thinking about positive rewards for reading, and they talk about different reinforcers, both intrinsic and extrinsic, and strategies to use with developing readers for both of those areas. 13, cooperate with the classroom teacher. If that's not you, reaching out to that classroom teacher, seeing what's being studied in the classroom, what they're noticing in the classroom, if there's any way that you can, continue or extend upon what's being learned in the classroom, or maybe, reading about a similar topic or the same author, or anything that can support the learning in the classroom, that would be wonderful. 14, enlist parent involvement, and they give you specific ideas to share with parents to encourage them to work with their student at home. And then lastly, let research guide your instruction. And that's really a focus of the course. One of our objectives I just shared is for you to be able to really look at that research, both through, you're going to be reading, chapters from instructing students on each of those different areas of reading, as well as the core teaching sourcebooks that are going to give you research-backed strategies for developing different areas. So making sure to use that research and let it guide you. Decisions. Next in the text, they talk about all the decisions you get to make as the clinician within materials and equipment, looking at, what are the reading materials going to be? Are you using individual books in a series, kits and box sets, magazines, newspapers? And it gives you a whole host of ideas of, titles. High quality literature suitable for less able elementary school readers is on page 242. Talks about workbooks and reproducibles, if there's a time and a need for those things, but, not to use them ad nauseum. Talk about games, which can be fun and engaging for students, but you don't only want them playing games because then they're never reading any connected text. And then they talk about teacher materials, created materials as well. There's a lot on technology and equipment, going from traditional media to tools you can use for drill and practice, assessment and record keeping, internet books, ebooks and assistive reading, internet tools, different instructional applications. So, lots and lots of resources you can pull in here. They do have some key considerations to think about with technology. Just again, with anything you plan, whether it be a worksheet or a game or technology, making sure that if it's going to present a usable skill, a skill that aligns to a designated need you found from the assessment data, and if the skill is practiced in such a way that it's going to give the student success in mastering that skill. Next, they talk about physical organization of the space, which may or may not be in your control, but thinking about how to make it an inviting environment for your student, as well as how to organize your materials and supplies within that environment. So, it helps you move fluidly from one activity to the next, because we know we don't want to be wasting time. We want to spend as much time on task as possible. So how can you organize the room and the materials so that you can do that? And what kinds of materials and things will you need? And then lastly, they talk about instructional organization, which basically is how you should structure your instructional time. And they make the following recommendations. As I said earlier, 1/3 of every class period should be devoted to reading. So making sure if you have an hour session, at least 20 minutes is the student reading. That 20 minutes can be broken down into, a 5-minute warm up and then, 20 or 15-minute practice somewhere in the middle. So it doesn't have to be one large block of them reading the whole time, but you can break it up. All readings should be connected to comprehension activities. And I regret that is one thing that is not reflected well on the sample whipper. There's a lot of fluency practice using the stopwatch activity, but there isn't ever any comprehension check. So even if you are working on fluency and that is a definite need that you are focusing on, still have a comprehension measure there. Activities should be based on assessed needs and varied throughout the class period. So really thinking about, what did my assessment results show? What are my top priorities for this student? And then what activities will support those? Providing opportunities for student choice whenever possible. Spending time reading aloud to students or having them listen to tape stories. So, if you are modeling how to apply a comprehension strategy or a monitoring strategy, that would be a good time to read aloud. And then modifying lessons if students aren't making progress. So there are a lot of different resources you can use to help you prepare for intervention. Instructing students, pages 220 to 221, not 2,000 pages of information. Sorry about that. They show you a reading recovery lesson from the student's perspective. You can check that out. Pages 263 to 264 of Instructing Students has a page out of a teacher's, quote, lesson plan book. The only thing this doesn't do well, it does give you a lot of time of connected reading of text, but it doesn't actually give you the objectives for the student and make it clear, what the focus is. So make sure you do that on yours. Next Step Forward and Guided Reading gives you sample lessons as well as how to set your lessons up. In the Week 5 block on titanium, I have a document created by Dr. Glasswell that gives you video links to see guided reading lessons from Next Step Forward in action. There's also, if you don't have Next Step Forward, there's a folder of guided reading resources in Week 5 block, and it has some additional items as well, in addition to what you can find in your Next Step Forward book. And then lastly, I'll give you an example as well. So you might recall my student Hope, who pseudonym used, I've been telling you about, that I was working with and assessing and doing some intervention with. Well, based on my assessment data, I found that her long-term goals are really motivation. She doesn't really enjoy reading. She doesn't seek out reading opportunities outside of the classroom. She hasn't really found anything that's hooked her into reading outside of the school day. So that is one of my goals, is really to motivate her to read for leisure and pleasure, as we know is so important, and you'll read about again in Chapter 7. My next goal, which is really not as high of a priority, is to improve her fluency, specifically rate, because she does read a little slower, although it's not hindering comprehension. It is taking her longer to read things, and I think that is hurting her self-perception a little bit. She doesn't see herself as strong of a reader as her friend. So if I can, bolster her rate a little bit, I think that might help her attitude towards reading. My next goal is to help her spell words more accurately within the late affixes and early derivational relation stages. So I'm going to bring in words their way activities from those levels. And then lastly, to improve her metacognitive monitoring and the ability to think at different levels of comprehension while reading. So you might recall in my assessment results, well, actually in an informal conversation, she talked to me about how she often dozes off while reading. Like she just doesn't know what she's reading about because she's not actively monitoring her reading. And then also, when she's not really thinking about the text at high levels. So those are my long-term goals for her. That's probably going to take me the entire 10 weeks to hit. But then within my first session of intervention with her, I want to get a baseline data point for words correct per minute at, grade level text to see how she is doing. And I want to introduce precision reading as a tool for building fluency. It's something she could do at home with a parent. And then also she receives immediate and corrective feedback. And what precision reading is you have the student has the passage in front of them, you have the passage in front of you in a sheet protector. And as they read, you follow along with a, expo or whatever and notate on there any miscues that they have. And then after a minute, mark how far they got, and you can give them Dibble's passages are great for this because it has the running total of words on the right margin. But so, after the minute, you stop them, you give them the immediate feedback of this is how many words per minute you read. For someone at your grade, the goal really should be this. So, each week we want to increase our 2 to 5 words per minute or whatever it is to ultimately reach that goal in 10 weeks. So we're going to read it again and see if you can beat your time, and then you have them read it a second time. And then you stop them after the minute, you tell them, words correct per minute, you give them any feedback on miscues, errors made, and then you do it a third time. So you do 3 repeated readings of the same passage, then they can always take that passage home, practice it. But again, make sure you ask them some measure of comprehension so they don't just think we're reading for the sake of reading fast, but still to make sense of the text. So that's precision reading. Another thing I want to do is do Greek and Latin roots and their meanings, and that's going to come out with the Words Their Way lesson. And then monitor when there is a breakdown in comprehension, and to be able to apply one of 3 fix-up strategies. So reread, ask questions, summarize, and retell, which I'm going to model first, and then I'm going to have her apply it at the end when she independently reads either aloud or silently. I'll give her the option there. So planned activities, I didn't detail this out, but you need to do that in your WIPR. This was, something I drafted merely for the sake of kind of sharing with you my thought process and approach with my student. But as far as my schedule with her, I would spend the first 2 to 5 minutes doing good news and sharing the schedule for the day. The next 10 minutes is spent on precision reading, which is going to help that fluency rate goal. I'm going to allocate 20 minutes for the Words Their Way word study lesson. And basically, when I, exactly where I see there is a need based on the spelling inventory, that's the lesson I'm going to pull for that. I'm going to spend 10 minutes explaining what metacognitive this should say monitoring, what metacognitive monitoring is, and then, modeling how to monitor, as well as how to apply those 3 different fix-up strategies. And then the next 20 minutes, the student's going to be reading and applying what we did here. And then lastly, it's cut off, but the last 2 minutes, I'm going to share a closing quote. So things I need, my agenda typed up. I like to have that out in front of me so I can follow along, student can follow along, maybe even check things off. I want to have my Dibbles passages ready for this precision reading. The words their way lesson materials for sort number 35, which is where we're going to be starting and probably going in sequential order from that, unless I'm noticing she needs more time with something, less time, we can move forward. I always like to have a tabletop whiteboard with markers so that I can, write and she can see visually anything I'm teaching. I decided to select the Mystery of the Roman Ransom since through the interest inventory, I found that she really liked Toga, what is it? Detectives in Togas or something like that, but same author. So we're going to read another novel by the same author that we're going to work on monitoring and fix-up strategies with, and then the closing quote. So that is my rough plan for my student and kind of walk you through my thought process there. You will get to try your hand at that yourself this week. So good luck to you. Have fun with your student. Remember to apply all these principles from chapter 7, all 15 of them, to your work with your student, and you will be highly successful. Good luck.